Miller knew that everything he was sending was being sent without approval, because they would read it in the looking glass backwards. I was rather gung-ho at that time and felt that we ought to eliminate his controller, but wiser counsel prevailed, and we didn't. But from that moment onwards, as a matter of policy, one could not use Tricycle as a deception channel. It would have been far too dangerous.
Juan Pujol was a Spaniard who began his spying career in Madrid. He later became known as GARBO.
I don't know what made GARBO tick, but he didn't like the Germans much. A lot, in fact. And so he decided he'd like to be a British agent. And he came to the embassy, and they told him to bugger off, roughly speaking. They weren't playing.
Having been turned down by the British, GARBO offered his services to the Abwehr in Spain instead. The Germans accepted, and GARBO decided to go to Lisbon, then the spy capital of Europe. From Lisbon, the new German agent began to write regular reports for the Abwehr in Madrid. Not on the situation in Portugal, but on conditions in Britain. For GARBO was double-crossing the Germans, fooling his controller, Karl Erich Kulenthal, and his fellow intelligence officers into believing that he was writing from London, and that his letters to the Abwehr were carried by a secret courier. In reality, the main sources for GARBO's reports were a handful of English reference books and a vivid imagination.
I think he had a map. I think he had an atlas. And he invented an agent, and he gave her the grandest name he could think of. He called her Lady Smith-Jones, because those were the the most English names he knew. And he managed very well, thank you very much.
The Abwehr were in fact delighted with GARBO's information.
Why the Germans believed it, I cannot imagine. I mean, some of it was such unbelievable rubbish. I mean, describing how the vineyards in Wales were suffering from the drought or the frost, or whatever it was. It's quite extraordinary.
Although GARBO continued to offer his services to the British authorities in Lisbon, he didn't come to the attention of MI5 in London until Bletchley Park picked up Abwehr's signals concerning a mysterious German spy who was supposed to be operating in England.
Fortunately, MI5 discovered in conversation with SIS in Lisbon, they discovered about GARBO and the fact that he was accepted by the Germans as a viable agent. And it was decided after a good deal of argument that GARBO should be brought to this country, because if he remained in Lisbon, it was quite certain that sooner or later he'd be blown.
GARBO left Lisbon for Britain in order to work under the direct control of MI5, who would make sure that his constant flow of letters would continue. Ahead of him lay the biggest challenge of his life. By now, MI5 had moved its headquarters to Blenheim Palace near Oxford, after Wormwood Scrubs had suffered considerable bomb damage. MI5 was confident that all major German spies in Britain had been caught or were under its control. With the help of Bletchley Park and Ultra, the double agents were used increasingly for the purpose of strategic deception, to support a growing number of Allied military operations. The Allies now planned Operation Overlord, the invasion of the Normandy coast. They put in place a massive deception scheme, codenamed Fortitude, to convince the Germans that the landings would occur further east, along the Pas-de-Calais. In this operation, the double agents were assigned a major role.
The deception plan was brilliantly thought out. The cover plan created an imaginary army, and we gave the Germans the impression that we had available almost twice the number of troops that were in fact in existence.
Through its double agents, MI5 sent messages which suggested the existence of FUSAG, the first US Army group in the southeast of England, on standby to invade the Pas-de-Calais. In reality, FUSAG was little more than a figment of the imagination, yet the Germans became convinced that it was real. One of those analysing the German reactions to this deception scheme was the MI6 officer and codebreaker Hugh Trevor Roper. After the war, he also interrogated former members of the Abwehr.
I can't remember who it was, but it was an Abwehr officer who had defected and who said, you must understand that from the point of view of an Abwehr officer, it was better to send in a false report or a report from a false agent than no report at all. That it was they wanted to keep their, on the whole, comfortable jobs in the Mediterranean or in Portugal, than to go back to Germany and be transferred to the Eastern Front or something like that.
Why did the German army believe the Abwehr agents? They were not able any longer to mount overflights over the United Kingdom because they had completely lost command of the air. If they had mounted overflights, they would have seen a lot of conspicuous display of dummy tanks and dummy landing craft and dummy aircraft to back up GARBO's stories. And so, for lack of anything better, they believed the Abwehr agents, and in particular GARBO, who became almost a sort of solo player. Whereas up till the summer of 1944, there'd been an entire orchestra of deception.
Working from a small flat in central London, GARBO had convinced the Germans that he had recruited a large network of agents and sub-agents throughout Britain, who were in an ideal position to report on Allied troop movements. These non-existent agents were the brainchild of both GARBO and his ingenious case officer, Tommy Harris, an artist and painter of Anglo-Spanish descent.
All the agents were imaginary. None of them existed. And there were 7. And quite a lot of them had sub-agents. So it was a notional network. You had to remember or keep a record of where they were all supposed to have been so that they could work together and coincide. They all had their own characteristics, and some information could be sent by one agent but not by another, because it'd be the sort of thing that he would never find out or be interested in. They each had their own sphere of work. And as they weren't there at all, of course, it would be easy to get them mixed up. The agent in Liverpool was too well placed, so he had to be got rid of somehow or other. So he died, and his obituary came in the local paper. But of course he'd never been there in the first place.
The timing and the location of the Normandy landings on the 6th of June 1944 came as a surprise to the Germans. To preserve GARBO's credibility, MI5 and GARBO were allowed to send a last-minute message that warned the Germans of the imminent invasion. As it turned out, the German radio operator had switched off his receiver for the night, and GARBO's message wasn't picked up until much later in the day. On the morning of the invasion, Hitler was sleeping late at his Bavarian mountain retreat. He didn't seem particularly concerned. Even before the landings, German intelligence officers had convinced Hitler that the main Allied thrust was going to be in the Pas-de-Calais. The Germans soon picked up another message by GARBO, in which the double agent stressed that the Allies were preparing a second attack further east.